It's my pleasure to be here, sandwiched between these guys here. And I hope you bear with me through my talk. I'm not going to read all this, but I will actually have to look down and refer to my paper and notes here. The co-author on my project with this is Dr. Naomi Duke, and she and I have worked together across a number of projects. And this being one which we're planning probably this summer will end up becoming a publication, sending it out. But it thinks about HIV/AIDS and the prison pipeline, and that prison pipeline leading to African American women. And as a kind of backdrop to this work, I have been thinking much along the same lines of Martha, and our work has so many crossovers. You know, you look from project to project, and it's as if we're in sort of spirit conversation from afar, and then we get together and like, we've been thinking about the same thing. And we have. So I've been thinking about secrecy and the way in which that unfolds in society and in the law, and then in ways in which it doesn't. And certainly in the African American community, silence, secrecy, shame, dignity, all these principles, values, issues, characterizations, I think all have touch points on HIV and AIDS. In the US, there are more than 1 million people who are living with HIV, and more than 500,000 have died from AIDS since the beginning of the epidemic, now 3 decades ago. And as you've heard, although initially branded as a white male disease in the US, the face of HIV and AIDS has dramatically changed. It's dramatically shifted. African American women who make up just under 15%, in fact about 12% of the US population, now account for 2/3 of new HIV infections. HIV is now the leading cause of death for African American women aged 25 to 34, and the third leading cause of death for African American women ages 35 to 44. And it's compromising, we argue, the survival and future growth of the African American population. Again, it's a face of AIDS that we just don't account for or think about. The majority of these women represent a changing face in the epidemic in the United States, and their infections resulting from contact with their African American male partners, who often do not know that they are infected. In our project, what we've wanted to think about and to look at is how the war on drugs and mandatory sentencing laws result in these gross disparities with significant public health consequences. For example, empirical data suggests that disparate sentencing guidelines regarding crack and cocaine disproportionately impacts arrests, prosecutions, sentencing, and incarceration. The bottom line is a gross disparity in who is incarcerated in U.S. prisons, more black men than any other group. Our contribution to this literature is to look at what occurs in prison and its impacts outside of prison. For example, the collateral effects include African American men suffering and dying disproportionately from HIV and AIDS and infecting their heterosexual female partners. Now, of course, another backdrop to this has to be one of the things that we've not talked about just within the structures of the African American community and what the church has represented. In a book edited by David Goodwin some time ago, I guess about 6-7 years ago, on religion and bioethics, I have a chapter in there that looks at the African American church and its role in this crisis. The African American church has played not only a religious role, I think in fact it so oversimplifies, and in fact even neglects the real power of the African American church, which has been a political institution. It has been a legal institution, it's been a medical institution. For many people who don't know, during the time in which the federal government in fact would not provide family support to African Americans or to families where the parents were not married, it was the African American church that was for African Americans that picked that up. Many of the old black churches had their own law firms inside, and not for the church, but for the people who needed legal representation. If you track the old black churches in the United States, you'll also find that they had their own medical clinics with their doctors, because African Americans have died literally on the steps of white hospitals in the United States, where they just simply would not be treated. So the African American church has served as a political, a health, a legal, a very important social institution within the community. And if within that space there is homophobia, or that is in fact your family, then it all gets shut down. And so that article dealt with that, and I think that that's an important, when we think about what's happened in these communities, even though there has been a slight shift in recognition, a slight shift in African American churches having to come out of the closet, still being so deeply entrenched in the, we're talking about the choirs and everybody, they're like all gay. But even with some slight trickling out of the closet, still it remains an entrenched homophobia that makes it then very difficult for the congregants, for the community, to get the kind of support that they need around an issue like this. Take up almost anything in the African American church, that you murdered somebody, you stabbed somebody, you slept with their wives, all of that, but don't come in saying that you're gay, right? And then that's a problem. So in this project, what we've wanted to do is to look at that prison pipeline, because we see it as a missed opportunity with much of the work that has been done, that we've not sort of seen that. And we start off this project, this article, in fact, giving an example of a woman who, in fact, waited for years for her husband to come out of prison. And that is what she did. In fact, she didn't see anybody else till her husband came out of prison while she was raising their daughters. And then 18 months after Mrs. Davis's husband returns from prison, they learn that he's dying of AIDS. And then she receives the devastating news that she too is infected with HIV, and this is after years of living without him. But of course, upon his return home, her fate is much similar to the fate of a lot of African American women, as I shared, given the statistic. And for many of these women, the days are mixed, because, as I say, the institutions within the African American community that are very important for cultural support may not, in fact, be available. So HIV and AIDS in the prison population, in the larger communities, is a significant concern. And as I mentioned, it's a missed opportunity within the greater literature to talk about these issues. Now, I want to just give some, to help fill in even more, the statistical narrative here, and I think that that's also important. Despite stabilizing rates of HIV and AIDS morbidity and mortality for the United States, the African American community continues to suffer significantly the negative impacts of this infection and related opportunistic diseases. HIV is the 9th leading cause of death for the African American community, and the 3rd leading cause of death for black men and women, as I mentioned before, 35 to 44 years old. Within a lifetime, approximately 1 in 16 black males and 1 in 30 black females will be diagnosed with HIV, right? I mean, that's pretty powerful. Blacks account for just about 50% of all new HIV infections in the 50 states. It's pretty powerful. The rate of new infections for black males is 6 times that of white, non-Hispanic males. It is 3 times that of Hispanic males, and it's twice that of black females. However, outside of black men, so once these are sort of huge figures, devastating figures, outside of black men, black women exhibit the highest rates of new HIV infection. higher than Hispanic men and women, and higher than white non-Hispanic men and women combined. Currently, the rate of AIDS diagnosis for African American women is 15 to 20 times that of white non-Hispanic women, and 4 times that of Hispanic women. 2 modes of exposure place African American women at high risk for contracting HIV: injection, drug use, and heterosexual contact. Heterosexual contact is the most frequent route of HIV transmission for this group. And as I say, for our project, what we want to do is to look at why there is this imbalance, and we point our research to the prison pipeline, and I want to place even more emphasis on what you mentioned, which is that it's perceived that these outcomes relate to more a sort of risky behavior in the African American community. So if it's true that there's this pipeline from men to women, then it's because the men are just engaging in more risky behavior than their other counterparts. And it's actually not true. It's not true. With the exception of marijuana, African American men actually report much less drug use, risky drug use during life. They might like their marijuana, like Snoop Dogg or whatever, but other than that, they're not dropping acid and right, exactly. It's not an HIV risk, right? You know, they're not dropping acid and mushroom in middle school and all the rest of that stuff. You know what I'm talking about. Oh, and my classmates were doing. I was not doing that. Hello now. Okay, but what is important then is to look at what kinds of structural factors lead to these types of outcomes. And I'm so happy that both of you have talked about that. And the structural outcomes that we talk about, other than this prison pipeline and in prison then access to rape, prison rape and the pipeline of, young African American men, the sort of terrible schools, and then the straight introduction into prison, making them very vulnerable to prison rape and prison sex. And the other is sharing needles, not necessarily for drug, but for tattoos and things like that. I mean, you look now, that whole, and even the basketball players are all like tattooed, and not looking like they went to fancy places, right? It just looks like somebody just took something like from a prison and just threw it into their bodies. But the structural factors that are very important for us to consider include poverty, discrimination, and lack of healthcare access. Right, and even within our prison population, and I'll conclude on this because I'm probably running out of time, which is that one of the tensions that we have within the law is, on one hand, the very importance of preserving our privacy. And that is very important because African Americans as a community within the medical context and outside of the medical context have been the subjects of incredible surveillance over and over again, not having the opportunity to fully live within the bounds of what the Fourth Amendment is really about. And yet at the same time, one of the big challenges in this domain, connecting to how we will find out whether or not folks are infected, is having tests in prison to find out whether or not you're infected, right? So how is it that we can get from point A to point B where we respect the bounds of the Constitution and yet remain mindful about what is plaguing the community that begins within prison? And I'll just stop there so that we can converse.
Thank you all for your incredible